I think everyone understands what rash and quick decisions can lead to. It is very rare to win, but most often such decisions only bring harm. One of these decisions was made by my wife when she told me that she wanted to divorce me and go to live with her lover. "Did you hear me, Arthur? You just need to sign the papers and it's all done." My wife, Annie, with whom I had been married for over 25 years, was speaking to me. I was trying to listen, but the longer she ranted, the more distant her voice seemed. It all began this afternoon when I came home from work. She was sitting at the table with a glass of wine and a determined look on her face. Unfortunately, she only had one glass out, and she was drinking from it. Considering how difficult the conversation was turning out to be, she hadn't thought I might also want a drink, or perhaps need one. I knew this was going to be bad as I sat down. She didn't ask about my day and instead immediately told me that she was leaving me. Annie had found her soulmate, someone who made her heart sing in a way I never did, and I was no longer good enough for her. It was hard to hear her, as her voice seemed to grow louder and yet softer at the same time. Our story was quite typical. Annie and I had gotten together in high school and stayed together. Our daughter Sally was born about 6 months after we got married. She wasn't the main reason we got married, but she was a factor. Today, we both had good jobs, and while we weren't rich, we were upper middle class. We had paid off our house a few years ago and had a decent savings account. We often expressed our love for each other, regularly went on vacation with the whole family. And although we didn't have as much intimacy as when we first started dating, on average it happened a couple of times a week. I believed we loved each other deeply and would have said we were going to grow old together until this afternoon. Annie was still ranting. Her face was turning red as she continued to tell me what was happening. Arthur, look at me." It was becoming difficult to concentrate, but I turned my head towards her. "You need to sign these papers." She kept pointing at the documents in front of me. Her voice was demanding, but I was struggling to focus. It was as if the light and color of the room were fading, even though the kitchen lights were on. In my mind, I was distressed, but my body was unresponsive. And the longer I didn't respond, the more furious Annie became. The last thing I remember is Annie slapping me. I couldn't feel the blow. I imagined it would leave a big red mark. But again, I couldn't move, and the world kept going dark.
It had been a long day, and the drive home from university was delayed due to an accident that slowed everyone down. When I finally got home, I couldn't quite place it, but the house felt eerily quiet. The lights were on, my dad's car was there, but my mom's car was missing. As I entered the kitchen, I dropped my bag and books on the floor. My dad was sitting at the table, unmoving, just staring into space. On the other side of the table was an open bottle of my mom's wine and a nearly empty glass. In front of my dad was a stack of papers with numerous "Sign Here" tabs. I walked over to him and touched his shoulder from behind. "Hey, Dad!" I expected him to turn or jump, but he didn't respond. I moved around to face him and couldn't help but gasp. His eyes were glazed over, almost milky white, and it looked like he had been crying earlier, but he wasn't blinking. A trail of drool was starting to drip from his mouth into his lap. Panic set in. "Dad! Dad! Come back to me, Dad!" I couldn't stop myself from crying. After a minute, Dad still wasn't responding. I knew I needed to stay calm. I told myself, "Slow down, Sally. Dad needs help." I took out my phone and dialed 0000 for emergency services. I informed them that I couldn't get my father, Arthur Other, to respond. They asked for my details and address, so I provided my name, Sally Other, and our home address. They dispatched an ambulance and told me it would arrive in about 10 minutes. For the next few minutes, I sat with Dad, held his hand, and spoke softly to him, reassuring him that everything would be okay. This man had given me everything while I was growing up. Despite his hard work, he always attended my school events, musicals, and ballet performances. When I first started learning the violin, he endured countless hours of my screechy practice, always encouraging me. Eventually, he saved enough to buy me a Heidersign violin for my 16th birthday. It wasn't the best violin available, but it was much better than my previous practice ones. 5 years later, I was at university studying music with a focus on strings and violin. I now owned 2 better violins, but that Heidersign held a special place in my heart because it was a gift from Dad. I wasn't sure what to do while I waited. Why was Dad acting like this? What had happened? And where was Mom? It was then that I glanced down at the paperwork and the words, "Petition for divorce," jumped out at me. What the hell? I read the first page of the document for a couple of minutes, and my skin started crawling. For reasons I couldn't understand, Mom wanted to divorce Dad. It seemed highly likely that Dad's condition was due to these documents, and judging by the open bottle of Mom's wine, she had given Dad the papers and walked out on him. People often wonder how emotions can change so quickly. I suppose they've never experienced something like this. For me, any compassion or desire to be around my mother evaporated. Shortly after, the ambulance arrived, and with my directions, they got Dad on a gurney and headed to the hospital. I followed behind after locking up the house, making calls as I drove. I called my grandmother, Dad's mom, his sister Rhonda, his best friend, and then his manager at work, giving them a quick rundown to let them know Dad would be off work for a while. I told them I had come home and found him unresponsive and that he was on his way to the hospital. Everyone asked me to keep them updated on his condition, and his manager told me he would arrange emergency leave for Dad and inform their boss. I knew I was delaying the next call because I was so angry with her, but I decided I needed to call Mom. The phone rang, and she picked up after a couple of rings. "Hi, Sally, my darling. How was your day?" Wow, just wow. Surely my mother wasn't naive enough to think I wouldn't know what was going on. It had been almost an hour since I walked into the house and found Dad. Mom also knew my schedule was fairly consistent, and I would have found him. "Where are you, Mom?" "I'm out and about, sweetie." She trailed off, not wanting to say anything. I could sense her hesitation. "So, in other words, you just destroyed my father, your husband, and walked out on him without a care then?" "Oh no, darling. I tried to explain to your father about Paul and what was happening, but he wasn't responding, so I thought it better to leave and let him process how we are not going to be living with him anymore." She was trying to talk like it was a simple thing. However, given the state I found Dad in, it was more than likely that she had just ripped his heart out and thrown it against the wall while he watched, if my guess was correct. "It looks to me like you walked out on him when he needed help. Are you that heartless? Do you know what's happening now, or don't you care?" There was anger beginning to leak into my voice. "Sweetie, don't get angry now. I know this is a bit of a shock, but your father will be fine. I will only ask for what is mine, as well as some support while Paul waits to marry me." Yep, my mother was moving into La La Land. "Angry? You haven't seen angry yet, Mom. Just so you know, I'm currently following Dad to the hospital in an ambulance. When I got home, he looked like he had a stroke." "Oh, Sally, my sweetie, I'm sorry to hear that, but—" "No buts, Mom. Let me ask you, is this Paul you're running off with the same Paul from your work that you keep talking about?" She hesitated. "Of course, darling." Paul was a colleague of my mother's whom she never stopped talking about. "So, as I understand it, he's a dozen years younger than you, and you've been having an affair with him for how long?" She hesitated again. 6 months. "Right. So, for the past 6 months, you've been sleeping with someone from work behind Dad's back. You've been lying to both Dad and me, hiding your affair. I had no idea you were capable of such betrayal, and obviously neither did Dad, judging by the state you just left him in. How in the world did you think either of us would be okay with this?" "Well, I suppose not at first, but once we're living with Paul, you'll see that we're meant to be together." "We." She had used "we" again. Did she think I was going to leave Dad to move in with her and her boyfriend? I could feel myself fuming. I knew I would say something stupid if I didn't stop. "I'm going to hang up now, before I say something I might regret. But let me be clear. I will not be moving away from Dad, and there is absolutely no way I am going anywhere near Paul, let alone to the place where you and he are messing around." "Sally Other," my mother replied. "I am your mother, and you will not speak to me like that, no matter how upset you are." "Then I guess we're done talking." and I hung up before she could say anything else. If she thought I was going to approve of what she was doing, she was mistaken. She tried calling me back multiple times. Then she started calling Dad's phone, which was pointless, because even if he could answer, he wouldn't take her call. I had Dad's phone with me, so I ignored all her calls. By the time I got to the hospital, the ambulance crew had admitted Dad, and he was under observation in a ward. Aunt Rhonda had arrived and told me she had also received several calls from my mother, but didn't know what was going on, except that her brother was in the hospital. When I explained what had happened, Aunt Rhonda's face turned a deep shade of red, almost as if steam was coming out of her ears. "Sally, do you have the documents that woman left for my brother?" "Sure, Aunt Rhonda, here they are." Apart from Rhonda being my aunt, she was also our family lawyer. So for the next hour, we sat beside Dad as Rhonda read through the documents and took notes, occasionally muttering under her breath. Doctors and nurses came in and out of the room periodically to check on Dad. "The bad news is that your mother is going to get her divorce from your father. The timeline laid out here shows that this process has been in motion for over 2 months and had to be served this week, or it would have cost her significantly more in legal fees." I shrugged. I had received all the justification I needed from my mother. I was determined to ensure that she and Dad separated after what she had done. It was strange. I was never a daddy's girl and always admired my mom, but her actions were just plain stupid. This was all due to Paul, her so-called soulmate. Regardless, if the man lying in bed next to me was any indication, Mom and Dad weren't going to survive this. The good news is that she hired a lousy lawyer to represent her. She's going to have to pay him a lot just for the divorce, and even more if it goes to court. Rhonda grinned. "Meanwhile, my dear brother has the best lawyer in town and will get the family discount." We smiled at each other for the first time that evening. Also, some of the demands here, where she wants 50% equity in the house and 60% of the financial assets, plus spousal maintenance and child maintenance, are probably quite absurd. From your reaction, I take it you're not planning to live with your mother? I shook my head no. Good. Okay. I have some initial thoughts. However, we need to see what happens with your dad over the next 24 hours. Your mother could already be in trouble for abandonment and mental cruelty. The next few days went by quickly, with doctors constantly checking on Dad. Physically, he was fine and healthy, but he just wasn't responsive. I managed to keep up with my university studies in the hospital chair by the bed, laptop and textbook in hand. Occasionally, a family member would come by to give me a break, and I would go home, sleep for a few hours, change, and come back. I'll admit I cried a bit at home, alone in the house. One of the biggest surprises was when the owner of the company where Dad worked came to check on him. While I knew his manager, Tom, I had never met his actual boss. Tina Williams was a striking woman, voluptuous but not overweight, with tanned skin, dark raven hair, and blue eyes that could smolder, making any man alive and likely a few women swoon. It turns out my dad had been part of a group at his work that supported Tina a few years ago when she went through a messy divorce. Her cheating ex-husband had tried to take most of their savings and nearly got half her business before Dad introduced her to Aunt Rhonda. Rhonda had turned the situation around, saving Tina from losing any part of her business and ensuring that Tina got child support for their then 6-year-old daughter. Tina visited several times and was shocked when I briefed her on what had occurred and why he was in the hospital. She brought cards from Dad's colleagues and would sit by his side, regaling him with tales from work. It turned out Dad was known for his humor in the office, and his absence was keenly felt. Just so you're aware, Dad works as an accountant for a financial clearinghouse that handles payments for banks. It's mundane work, but apparently, Dad adds a bit of brightness to everyone's day. About 2 weeks later, I returned from home after a shower and a nap. Upon entering the ward, I found Rhonda and Tina wrapping up a conversation. Though it seemed tense, their frustration was aimed at my mother, not each other. My mother had sent Tina a letter demanding access to Dad's past bonuses, even though they had already been paid. The letter stipulated that she receive 50% of them within 30 days or face legal action. Besides the absurdity of claiming money already received, it seems she and her new partner are in need of cash since I froze all our joint assets while Arthur is incapacitated, Rhonda remarked with a predatory grin. I chuckled, making my presence known. Indeed, this morning I received my first communication from Mum in 2 weeks, a text asking for a few $1,000s. I haven't responded as I'm still quite upset with her. I mean, she hasn't even asked about Dad since I informed her of what happened. Over the past few weeks, Tina had become increasingly protective of my father. Whenever my mother's name came up, her expression turned sharp, her voice lowered with evident disdain for any other. It was as if I could visualize flames flickering in her intense gaze. I dreaded the idea of Tina and my mother in the same room. I feared Tina's fiery demeanor might consume her. Despite my own reservations about my mother, she was still my mother. She's ruined an incredible man. Sally, without your father, I wouldn't have Clarice or my business. Many at the office supported me during one of my lowest periods, but your father went beyond, lending me his ear without judgment. He introduced me to your aunt here, ensuring I was cared for. If he were single, I would have pursued him relentlessly after my divorce. I shrugged, a smile breaking across my face. He won't stay married for much longer. Realization dawned on their faces. Rhonda giggled, and Tina smiled. Thank you, Sally. I needed that. I can't fathom what your mother has done to him or why she let go of such a wonderful man. I have to head to the office, but before I do... Tina approached my dad, and as Rhonda and I watched, she leaned in and gave him a tender, heartfelt kiss on the lips. She looked at us and smiled, but her expression quickly shifted to shock as my dad groaned.
As I regained consciousness, I sensed the gentle touch of lips on mine, applying just the right amount of pressure, carrying a tender affection I hadn't experienced in ages. Amidst the beeping of hospital machines and the ache in my muscles, I expected to find Annie by my bedside after such a loving kiss. Instead, it was Tina, wearing a smile. Tina? Approaching from the other side were Sally and Rhonda. Don't worry, Daddy. You're going to be all right, understand? It took a moment for my memories to catch up, and I realized Annie was either leaving me or had already left. What happened? For the next few minutes, they updated me on the situation. Sally had discovered me unresponsive and called an ambulance. She also found divorce papers revealing Annie's infidelity. They explained how Annie had threatened Tina after Rhonda froze our finances until they knew my condition. How long? 2 weeks, Arthur, Rhonda answered. I glanced at Tina. Did you kiss me? Tina blushed. Yeah, sorry, I was leaving for the office and said goodbye. I smiled. It's okay. I suppose I'm single now, so it's fine. Over the course of the next several hours, a series of doctors came by to examine me. They conducted physical checkups, ran blood tests, and performed various procedures. Tina postponed her office visit to stay by my side, as did Rhonda and Sally. Among the doctors who attended to me was a psychologist. As he questioned me, I recounted arriving home to find Annie drinking alone, who then informed me she was leaving. As her behavior escalated, I described how the world seemed to lose its vibrancy. Sensory perceptions dulled, and I struggled to move despite growing agitation. My last memory was of Annie yelling and striking me, though her words were unintelligible. The girls collectively reacted with shock upon learning of Annie's abuse while I was incapacitated. Daddy, when do you think you lost the ability to respond? I'd estimate around 5:30, sweetheart. Why do you ask? Because I didn't find you until after 7:30, and there was no mark on your cheek, so I assume Mum must have left you there alone for quite a while. The psychologist weighed in, saying, It's not uncommon for individuals in your circumstances to experience abuse while unresponsive. Given your reaction to your wife's announcement of leaving you, it seems you may have entered a state of shock. While your case is more severe than what we typically encounter, it does follow a logical pattern. Rhonda added, When Arthur was young, there was an older bully who used to tease him a lot. One day, Arthur was found lying in the local park, and our parents put him to bed. He woke up the next day as if nothing had happened. It wasn't really dwelled upon at the time. I recalled. I remember Billy was picking on me in the park. Eventually, I lost consciousness. and when I woke up, my parents told me I had fainted and someone brought me home. They confronted Billy's parents, and the next day at school, Billy apologized to me. I chuckled at the memory. I doubt he meant it, but he never bothered me again after that. Well, it seems there might be some precedent for this, remarked the psychologist. In many respects, the workings of the mind are still a mystery. However, if similar occurrences have occurred in the past, it's plausible they could recur. I furrowed my brow. He reassured me with a smile. Don't fret too much. With the care and affection of these three wonderful ladies, even if such an event were to happen again, I believe you'll be in good hands. We continued our conversation for a few more minutes before he excused himself. I found myself unexpectedly fatigued as well. It might sound odd for someone who had just slept for 2 weeks straight, but it was the case. So, I sent all three girls home to get some rest and assured them they could visit me tomorrow to check on my well-being. Over the next 2 days, I gradually re-entered normal life. Tina provided me with a work laptop and some straightforward tasks to tackle at my leisure, should boredom strike. Meanwhile, Rhonda stopped by primarily to review revised divorce documents and obtain my signature on some paperwork related to ending my marriage to Annie. During her visit, Rhonda also introduced me to a young detective named Karen Hill. Detective Hill conducted a thorough interview with me, delving into my experiences with Annie that fateful night. Afterward, she expressed gratitude for my cooperation and indicated that her report would be forthcoming in a few days. Unsure if we were pursuing a complaint against Annie, I deferred to Rhonda, who assured me she would handle everything before bidding me farewell, with a kiss on the forehead. On the second day after emerging from what Sally referred to as my checkout phase, I was cleared to return home. Sally accompanied me, and to my surprise, Tina awaited us at the door, assisting Sally in guiding me to her spacious SUV. Tina stayed for dinner that evening, and after we enjoyed takeout together, she pitched in with the cleanup before joining us for a few hours of television. Upon her departure, Sally embraced her warmly and ensured I escorted her to her car. Tina, I'm incredibly grateful for all you've done these past weeks. I'm not sure how I can ever repay you. Well, when you're feeling like yourself again in a few weeks, you can treat me to dinner and dancing. I blushed. Fresh out of the hospital, and the woman whose kiss had stirred me awake was asking me out. But she was attractive, and according to Annie, I was soon to be a single man again. All right, next Friday night after work. That gives me nearly 2 weeks to get back to normal, right? She nodded, giving me a tight hug that lingered a bit longer than usual, hinting at something more. As she drove off, I chuckled at the momentary lapse where I couldn't recall my wife's name of 25 years. Over the next days, Sally, Rhonda, and Tina continued to fuss over me, ensuring I was all right. It was comforting. However, Rhonda's news that Friday afternoon caught us off guard. So Annie was arrested this afternoon, she announced. What happened? I inquired. Following your statement to the police in the hospital, an arrest warrant was issued for Annie on charges of mental cruelty to a disabled person. It's because you were considered mentally disabled and defenseless at the time, and she left you unattended for an unknown duration. She's in serious trouble. What does this mean for the divorce? Tina interjected, rejoining us for dinner. That evening, Tina had her 8-year-old daughter Clarice with her. Clarice was watching a Disney movie in the lounge room while we talked. Since I was returning to work on Monday, Tina would see me then. However, I began to realize that she was seeking more than just an efficient number cruncher in the office. I found myself intrigued by the idea of Tina, imagining her and what lay beneath those well-fitted clothes she wore each time she visited. Rhonda smiled. This might work out in Arthur's favor in several ways. I'm advocating for a 50-50 split on the bank accounts and house. I know we could ask for more given the circumstances, but I think Arthur will want to be fair. I nodded. Annie won't be able to touch any of the bonus money she tried to extort from you, Tina. I've filed charges against her for extortion along with mental cruelty. It won't do much besides preventing her from accessing what isn't rightfully hers. She'll likely be out in a couple of days, none the worse for wear, and probably back with her awful soulmate. What I want to do is expedite the divorce using Arthur's hospitalization and recovery as a pretext. Then, depending on Annie's reaction, I have plans. I'll ensure Arthur doesn't lose anything he shouldn't. She smiled. So, how long will the divorce take, Aunt Rhonda? Sally asked. If all goes well, it should take about 3 months. After that, if Annie wants to contest anything, I'll bring in the heavy artillery, which will prolong the process but hit her much harder. That evening, as I escorted Tina to the car, Sally assisted Clarice into the spacious back seat of the large suburban vehicle. Tina embraced me again and surprised me with a quick kiss, reminiscent of our recent awakening together. Arthur, I understand you're married and I respect your integrity, so I won't rush things. But I want to declare my interest in you now and let you know that I desire you. Admittedly, I've desired you for quite some time. However, I would never pursue a married man or disrespect someone's marital vows. I've experienced that myself, and I wouldn't want to inflict that pain on someone else, even if their marriage is faltering. I gazed into her deep blue eyes for a moment, brushed a strand of her dark hair from her face, and then leaned in to kiss her. Yet instead of a gentle kiss, I allowed it to be a passionate one, lasting perhaps 30 seconds. I could feel the connection between us, and it was mutual. Tina's eyes were closed as I pulled away, her tongue grazing her lips, savoring the moment. I grinned. Consider that my acceptance of your declaration. We turned to see the girls, both giggling as they witnessed our kiss. Clarice applauded, and Sally wore a wide grin. As Tina and Clarice reversed out of the driveway, Sally hugged me, and we waved them off. The following months were quite tumultuous. On one hand, Annie was eager for the divorce proceedings to progress swiftly. On the other hand, she was dissatisfied with the proposed settlement. It seemed like Paul was in control, insisting that Annie should receive the majority of the assets. He was deceiving her, and deep down she must have realized it after so many years of marriage. As the demands for the settlement became increasingly unreasonable, Rhonda had a solitary conversation with Annie's lawyer. While I'm unsure of the details, all objections to the settlement suddenly vanished overnight. During this time, Tina and I had a standing date every Friday night, while Sally took care of Clarice, picking her up from school and looking after her, giving Tina and me the opportunity to enjoy dinner, coffee, and a show or dancing. Naturally, our interactions never went beyond holding hands and kissing, but I had a feeling that the night my divorce was finalized would be something entirely different. I returned to my job and things were going smoothly. Our financial organization was making a tidy profit, though we weren't among the major players. We all diligently carried out our tasks, were compensated well, and generally enjoyed each other's company. It seemed like my colleagues had picked up on the budding romance between Tina and me. While everyone was supportive, I had to dial back my usual behavior, especially since my direct manager, who reported to Tina, emphasized the importance of maintaining appropriate workplace conduct, given my relationship with his superior. About 3.5 months later, we received notice that the divorce would be finalized in a week. Annie requested a meeting before the final decree, which I agreed to. We arranged for her to visit our home to discuss matters with both Sally and me. I took the afternoon off from work and prepared lamb chops and gnocchi in a burnt butter sauce for the three of us. It was a favorite dish for all of us, and I hoped it would ease any tension during our conversation that evening. Sally arrived home around 5:30, went to freshen up, and just before 6, the doorbell rang, revealing Annie standing on our doorstep. I haven't described Annie until now, but perhaps it's time, with a then and now perspective. Before recent events, Annie was an attractive woman in her mid-40s. She had short brown hair, a curvaceous figure, and though she carried a bit more weight than she preferred, she was still appealing. With a well-proportioned bust and shapely behind, she was quite the catch. However, the woman I saw before me now was almost unrecognizable. Annie had gained a significant amount of weight, with sagging cheeks, a protruding stomach, and an expanded rear end. Furthermore, she wore loose clothing that concealed even more. I have nothing against people of larger size, but that wasn't the Annie I knew. I think my surprise showed on my face. Annie grimaced but remained silent. Hello, Annie. Please come in." We entered the kitchen and I offered her a glass of wine, which she accepted. We engaged in small talk for a few minutes. She inquired about work and my well-being, while I only asked about her work, avoiding any mention of her appearance. "It's what Paul wants. He wasn't happy with how thin I was, so we've been working on adding some bulk." She addressed the unspoken question. I frowned. I had loved this woman for over 25 years. Despite what she had done to me, I still felt a lingering concern for her health, though it was greatly diminished. "You disapprove, don't you?" She looked at me. "Yes, Annie, I do. When we were together, you were a healthy size. But I must admit I'm taken aback by your current appearance. You don't seem well, and if I weren't so hurt by your actions, I would be more concerned about your health and try to help. But you don't care, do you?" Her expression fell. "You and Sally, you're happy and healthy without me." "Well, there's a part of me that does care. But when you walked out of here and left me feeling abandoned..." I shrugged and she sighed. "I deserve that. I did something terrible, didn't I?" "No, Mother." Sally emerged freshly from the shower. "You did a horrific thing. You tore apart a happy family all by yourself, then walked away without a care in the world. I, for one, can't fathom why Dad agreed to let you come here tonight. Sally, calm down. Your mother understands the situation we're in and how unhappy we all are. It must be difficult for her to come here. She requested this meeting tonight, so I felt it was only fair to listen to her." Sally wasn't pleased. From what I gathered, like me, she hadn't spoken to her mother since that fateful day. The way my daughter was glaring at her mother, it seemed like this wouldn't end well for anyone. Time to change the subject. I tried to inject some cheer. "Having difficult conversations right before dinner isn't ideal, so let's eat first." I served dinner, and no one spoke. However, there were many exchanged glances across the table. Sally just outright glared at her mother the entire time. After dinner, I cleared the table, and Annie asked to speak to Sally alone first. "No way. You can say whatever you want to me in front of both of us." I was torn. But it was clear that Sally was determined not to be left alone with her mother. I think Annie could see that too. The look in her eyes mirrored what her mother did to me that fateful night. She nodded. Annie paused, inhaling deeply. She hesitated to confront the situation in my presence, but turned to Sally. "Well, Sally, I want to apologize for my actions that night. I realize now that I didn't think things through properly. And despite everything, I don't want to estrange my daughter permanently." Glancing at me, Annie added, "There's more to discuss, but I'd prefer to do it in private without your father here." "Sorry, Mom, but if you can't say it in front of both of us, I don't want to hear it," Sally retorted. Before Annie could respond, Sally stood up and left, slamming her bedroom door shut moments later. "I hoped that would go better," Annie murmured softly, more to herself than to me. "I think it went as well as could be expected given the circumstances," I reassured her, indicating that I understood her concern. "Really?" "Yes, really," I sighed. "Annie, you have to realize that right now nobody in this household is particularly fond of you." She began to protest, but I raised my hand. "Let me finish and be blunt about it. First, you get into a long-term relationship with someone, and then you hide it from both Sally and me. Following that, you serve me with divorce papers out of the blue, and when I enter what Sally calls checkout mode, you erupt in yelling, screaming, and even physically assault me." Annie appeared stunned, like a deer caught in headlights. Yes, I was aware, and I remember most of that time until shortly after you first hit me. But let's continue. At some point, you simply walk out on me when I'm unresponsive, leaving me there until Sally arrives home and discovers me in the same condition. Annie's expression now shifted to panic. When Sally contacts you, you show no concern for me, despite your daughter clearly being distressed about her father. You never once inquire about my well-being until tonight. You make unreasonable demands of my workplace, and even now, as you walk in here, it's all about you. You ask Sally for forgiveness, yet you haven't apologized to her once. I paused briefly to let it sink in. Yes, Annie. I believe with all of that said, it went really well. Now Annie was staring at the floor, tears welling up in her eyes. They hadn't fallen yet, but they were on the brink. I couldn't tell if they were for Sally, myself, or if it was still all about her. I continued. So our divorce will be finalized tomorrow. If you have nothing else to add, I believe we've covered everything for this final meeting. Stepping towards the door, I opened it. Annie glanced at me before walking out. As she crossed the threshold, she turned back to face me. Arthur, we had some good years, didn't we? Yes, Annie, most of our time together was wonderful. You were a devoted partner, a loving spouse, and a doting mother. But I hardly recognize the person standing before me now. Whatever influence this Paul has had on you, it's changed you. I see someone who's lost. Someone who's become selfish and indifferent to those around her. She glanced down at her feet again. You truly believe that, Arthur? Yes, I do. With a heavy sigh, she began to leave, but then hesitated, her expression now one of despair. Arthur, about the house. Paul said I should ask. So that was the purpose of her visit. It wasn't about reconnecting with her family. It was solely about money. I couldn't help but laugh, leaving Annie puzzled. Tell your soulmate that your share of the savings and equity from this house will be in the bank account your lawyer gave to Rhonda by this time tomorrow. And Annie. She looked at me expectantly. Protect that money from Paul, or you won't have it for long. The next day marked the final decree. Annie and I were officially divorced. While a small part of me felt sadness, it was overshadowed by my overall happiness. The past few months had been difficult for everyone, but now I felt liberated. At 48, I still had much life ahead of me. Rhonda called to inform me that pizza was on her that evening at my place. During lunch at the office, Sally reminisced about happier times with her mother when we were still a family. Despite Sally's strained relationship with her mother, it was evident she missed the person her mother used to be. Truthfully, I felt the same way. We had shared many good years together. Later, there seemed to be a connection between Sally and Tina as Sally left, and I was summoned to Tina's office shortly after. As soon as Tina closed the door, she passionately kissed me as if there would never be another morning. I found myself reciprocating the gesture. Can I call you mine now, Arthur? I felt a tender spot on my neck where Tina had just kissed me, possibly leaving a bruise. I think you may have already claimed me. That evening's dinner was wonderful. I had Sally, Rhonda, Tina, and Clarice over, and we celebrated my newfound freedom from Annie. Later, that Friday night, after the girls had gone to bed, Tina and I expressed our love physically. I must have done everything right, because for the rest of the weekend, every time she sat down, she made a little squeak, as if she were slightly sore. But her eyes glowed with a fire that I knew was meant only for me. 6 months later, we had a beautiful wedding ceremony by a local lake, with many of our co-workers in attendance. We had hoped to wait longer to get married, but we wanted to be wed before Sally and Clarice's younger brother was born. 5 years had passed when Sally, her boyfriend Tina, and I found ourselves gathered for dinner at a local restaurant. It was then that 5-year-old Keegan inquired, "Daddy, who is that lady that keeps staring at us?" Turning our attention, we spotted Annie seated across the room. She had noticeably shed weight but appeared discontent. Since the divorce, we hadn't crossed paths with her. Not once did she attempt to reach out to Sally. Excusing myself from the table, I approached her. "Hello, Annie." "Hi, Arthur. How have you been?" She glanced down at her chicken salad. "You were right, Arthur. You were right about him. Paul convinced me that I was his soulmate and that you meant nothing. But when I didn't receive the money up front, he persuaded me to gain weight because he supposedly loved and preferred overweight women. Despite your advice against giving him the divorce settlement, I didn't listen. He squandered it in 6 months and then abandoned me." I was still angry with her, but her tale didn't conclude as happily as mine. "Since then, I've been striving to rebuild the confidence he shattered and return to some semblance of my former self." She held back tears and glanced at me. After all these years, that look was the Annie I remembered. "Arthur, I'm deeply sorry. I treated you terribly. I did it because I was convinced Paul knew things you didn't. I abandoned the only man who ever truly loved me. And—" She paused, gripping the edge of the table. "You could have been hurt because of my actions. I know you can never forgive me, but I want to express my remorse." Tears streamed down her face now. Surprisingly, Sally had approached, standing beside me. She too heard her mother's apology. I glanced at her and she offered a tired smile, gripping my hand. I wasn't sure if it was the right moment or if she sensed her mother's genuine regret for the first time. Nonetheless, her gaze softened and she reached out to her mother. Seeing Sally there, extending her hand, Annie panicked, attempting to rise and leave. But Sally wouldn't allow it, blocking her path. "Mom, please. You don't have to go anywhere." Sally slid into the booth next to Annie, while I settled in on the other side. I glanced at Tina, who nodded. So, for the next hour, mother and daughter conversed. There was much reconciliation, many tears shed. But this time they were healing, not harmful. Once the girls had caught up, Sally and I led Annie around the table, introducing her to everyone else. I could sense Annie's slight discomfort at being introduced to Keegan as Auntie Annie. After that day, Annie gradually returned to our lives. Sally began to rebuild her relationship with her mother, albeit slowly. They began to meet for a cup of coffee every week or two, and gradually trust was established between them. After all, when Sally got married, Annie took on the role of the bride's mother. Tina sometimes invited Annie to dinner at first, perhaps because Annie sacrificed herself and Tina won by marrying me. However, despite the fact that they never became best friends, Tina and Annie developed a kind of friendship that I could not fully understand. Rhonda never forgave Annie for her behavior towards me, although she maintained polite communication when they met. As for me, with Tina's approval, Annie and I went through several post-nuptial consultations. We have solved many problems that arose 5 years ago. The consultant suggested that Annie might have had a hormonal imbalance, but Annie completely rejected this idea. No, that day I gave up the most important things in my life. I had a loving husband and daughter who wanted me. No hormonal imbalance justifies the fact that I ruined all the good things in my life for someone who was terrible at absolutely everything. She smiled at me after her harsh statement. Arthur and Sally deserved a lot more from me, she said with tears in her eyes, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. It took me 5 years to rebuild the relationship, the 5 years I lost with them. I thank God every day that Arthur allowed me to return to his life. And Tina, too, she added, blushing slightly. She had every reason to hate me, but she always treated me kindly. No, she's lucky that she took everything I threw away, and I'm going to pay for it for a long time. Annie has benefited a lot more from these activities than I have. It was important to confirm that neither Sally nor I were to blame for Annie leaving us, and she was right. Tina helped us become better and made our family much stronger. They say that if people persist in their mistakes for long enough, they will eventually pay for them. Well, Paul certainly did. After moving to a neighboring state, he once again tried to have an affair with a married woman and steal her money. However, this time the husband caught Paul and his wife in the act. Her husband received a 10-year sentence, but there were rumors that he might soon be released, according to Rhonda, who is now his representative. As for Tina and me, our love is still strong. I never thought I could love someone as much as Annie, but Tina proved me wrong. She gave me not only her love, but her whole being without a trace. We continue to work together at her company, and I still hold the same position. We face difficulties, but we always put open communication at the forefront. Tina's beauty still fascinates me. One look from her and I locked the bedroom door. After an intimate moment together, we freshened up and headed to the kitchen, where we discovered Sally and Annie deep in conversation. Ever since Sally revealed her pregnancy last month, the excitement had been palpable, as the girls eagerly discussed the impending arrival of my first grandchild. Goodness, Sally, you'd think these two were teenagers by the way they're carrying on. Tina, you'll have to share the secret behind Arthur's diet. Maybe I can use it to spruce up Fred's meals. The room filled with laughter, and I felt a flush of embarrassment. Annie had been casually dating someone, but nothing serious until Fred came along. Mom, give them a break. We all know Dad has been on a bit of a mission lately, Tina interjected. Since when, honey? Annie inquired, a mischievous glint in her eye. You know, Tina replied with a playful twinkle in her eye. Annie paused. Sally chuckled, and Tina blushed. I simply leaned back in my chair, grinned at my daughters, and sensed that it was time to return to the bedroom. Tina joined me a moment later, quietly locking the door behind her.